What do you do when the son you trained to inherit your company starts acting like you're already dead, and you're not sure if it's paranoia or reality? How far would you go to find the truth? Far enough to fake a vacation, hide a camera in your own office, and watch what your family does when they think you've disappeared? This is how one recording almost broke me in half, and then became the exact tool I needed to protect everything I had left. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Leon, and by the time all of this started, people at my own company were already talking about me like I was a piece of old furniture nobody wanted to move, but nobody dared to throw away either. I was 61, and I had spent more than half my life inside the same building, walking the same warehouse yard, signing the same types of contracts, drinking bad coffee from the same dented kettle in the break room. I used to think that kind of stability was a blessing. Later, I understood it could also be used as a weapon, especially by people who believed your age made you slow, blind, and easy to replace. My days all began more or less the same way. I left our small apartment before 8, with Helga half asleep at the table, wrapping my lunch in foil and reminding me to take my pills. I took the same bus, sat in the same seat near the window, watched the same gray buildings roll by. At the yard gate, the security guard would lift his hand and nod. He still called me boss, even though on paper my son Max liked to use the title now. Inside the yard, the smell of diesel, rubber, and damp cardboard hit my nose as soon as I stepped onto the concrete. For a strange moment every morning, I felt younger again. The drivers were always my first stop. Some of them had started with me when their hair was still brown instead of white. They greeted me with jokes about my old jacket, about my slow walk, but their eyes were warm. They told me about traffic, delays, broken lift gates. I asked who needed time off for a sick child, who was arguing with a landlord, who had a toothache but did not want to see a dentist. Those details never showed up in any report, but they were part of the real company in my head. Max once said that I wasted time on emotional details. Maybe he was right. It was still my favorite part of the day. Inside the main building, the air changed. The open-plan office used to be a row of old desks with hanging wires and paper stacks. Now it was a sea of screens and headsets. Younger staff sat in rows, typing quickly, switching between chats and spreadsheets. They talked about funnels, conversion, and engagement. A big television on the wall showed live dashboards, colorful arrows going up and down. When I walked through, some said good morning. Others just gave a short nod and dropped their eyes back to the screen. They did not mean it badly, I think. For them, I was like the old company sign on the front gate. Still there, but not something you look at every day. Max liked to arrive later, but noisier. He moved through the office like a television host, slapping a shoulder here, asking about numbers there, stopping to comment on someone's shirt or someone's new haircut. His tie always matched his pocket square. His sleeves were always rolled just enough to show an expensive watch. Staff laughed at his jokes. Even when they were not funny, he said this kept morale high. I watched from near the coffee machine with my plain mug, and I felt like I was standing in a show that I had once created but no longer directed. That morning, he called a full team meeting in the big corner area near the windows. Someone wheeled in a screen. The chairs filled quickly. I sat in the back, as I often did now. Max stood at the front, with Eva beside him. She was not officially part of the company, but everyone had learned that her opinion traveled straight into Max's ear and stayed there. She wore a bright blouse and held a tablet, like a co-host. Max started by talking about our exciting new phase, the words he loved so much. He showed slides of growth over the last few years. He praised the marketing team. He praised the operations team. He said the company had finally stepped onto the national stage, and there was a polite wave of applause. Then he turned to governance and risk, the part that always bored most people. He said that with size came responsibility. He said investors, banks, and partners needed to see strong, unified leadership. He explained that, in modern times, businesses could not afford what he called unclear authority lines. He did not say my name yet, but I felt the air tighten. He pointed to a slide that showed boxes connected by arrows. The biggest box had his name on it as CEO. A smaller box beside it had my name, labeled Founder Advisor. The design looked clean, but the meaning was loud. He said that operational authority would be concentrated under active management, which was his box. He said that, going forward, high-value contracts and key decisions would be signed by one responsible person to avoid confusion. He added that all this was in line with best practice. People nodded as if this were obvious. I sat there with my arms crossed, listening to my son describe a structure where I still existed, but only as a decorative label. Eva then took over. She smiled at the staff and said that they all knew how much she respected tradition and family. Then she turned the conversation toward risk. She said there had been situations in other companies where older founders made emotional decisions, signed things because of relationships, and caused legal trouble. Without naming me directly, she said that sometimes love for people could cloud judgment and that the company needed to be safe from that. She mentioned age and health in a soft voice, like she was just caring, but the message underneath was sharp. She said that, for everyone's protection, they were reviewing who had sign-off rights, who appeared on which documents, and how responsibility would be structured. She said younger leaders, or at least active leaders, needed to be the ones whose names appeared on big contracts. A few staff members shifted in their chairs. Some looked at me briefly, then away. Max ended the presentation by saying that I would still be there as a wise advisor, someone they could always turn to for stories of the early days. People laughed kindly at that. To them, it was just a joke. To me, it sounded like being buried under a monument. After the meeting, Max came over, put a hand on my shoulder, and told me he hoped I liked the presentation. He said he knew change was hard, but that this was best practice. He said banks loved it. He said investors loved it. He said I would finally have time to rest, to spend more days with Helga, to enjoy life instead of worrying about numbers. I told him in a level voice that worrying about numbers had never bothered me. What bothered me was being treated like a risk inside the house I had built. He just smiled, like a doctor hearing a patient deny his diagnosis, and moved on to the next person. The rest of the morning was full of small cuts. I went to the logistics screen to check some deliveries, only to find that my login no longer opened certain views. A message appeared saying I did not have permission. When I asked a young analyst about it, he said Max had cleaned up roles in the system and that maybe my access had been moved. He looked uncomfortable, as if he had walked into a family argument. I thanked him and walked back to my office, feeling each step in my knees. My office was old-fashioned compared to the rest of the building. The desk was heavy wood with small scratches from years of use. On the wall were photos of the yard in the early days when we had only 3 trucks and a crooked sign. There was a framed picture of Max as a boy sitting on the hood of one of those trucks, holding a plastic steering wheel. I sometimes stared at that picture when I needed to remember why I had worked so hard. Lately, it only made my chest hurt. Around noon, Max told me he wanted to treat me to lunch. We went to a trendy cafe near the office, the kind of place with white walls, plants hanging from the ceiling, and food served on wooden boards instead of plates. 2 of his friends joined us, men in their 30s with neat hair and shiny watches. Ava arrived a few minutes later, taking photos of the latte art before sitting down. The conversation started with sports and travel, then moved quickly to business. Max talked about a possible new investor. He spoke in big phrases about scaling, expanding, and exiting. One of his friends asked how it was working with family. Max laughed and said it had its challenges. He said I had built something solid but old style, as if he was talking about a sturdy but ugly piece of furniture someone left in a new apartment. He said the real growth had started when he took over, when he modernized everything. His friends nodded and looked at me with polite smiles, like you look at an elderly relative at a wedding. Ava added that the hardest part of dealing with older founders was convincing them to let go before they made a mistake out of emotion. She said she had read articles about dementia and decision-making, about how the law sometimes needed to protect companies from their own parents. She said this while stirring sugar into her coffee with a soft laugh at the end, as if it was just a little joke. But her eyes did not look like she was joking. One of the friends asked if I still signed contracts. Before I could open my mouth, Max answered. He said that, in practice, he handled everything serious now. He said I was more like a chairman emeritus, a symbolic anchor, someone to show to banks and clients as proof of history while he managed the real work. They laughed. Only for a second, but it was enough. I realized in that moment they did not see me as a man who had fought for this company. They saw me as a logo with a heartbeat. After lunch, we walked back to the office. Max walked ahead with his friends. Eva walked beside them, talking about a possible press release for the new investor. I walked a few steps behind, listening to words like rebranding and leaning into the next generation. At the door, Max clapped me on the back and said he would send me a new schedule for board meetings, with lighter responsibilities for me. I told him calmly that I wanted to see any proposed changes in writing before agreeing to anything. He said of course, and smiled again. I went back to my office, closed the door, and just stood there for a while. The silence felt different this time. It did not feel peaceful. It felt like the silence you get in a room right after a glass breaks, when everyone is waiting to see if there will be blood. I walked behind the desk and looked at the shelves. My eyes moved over old binders, dusty trophies, small gifts from clients. On the top shelf, half hidden behind a stack of folders, I noticed a small cardboard box I had almost forgotten about. It was a cheap webcam we had bought months earlier and never used. Max had ordered it for some quick online presentation, then changed his mind and borrowed a more expensive camera from a friend instead. The box had been left there, unopened, like it did not matter. I reached up, took it down, and turned it in my hands. The plastic around it crinkled softly. The picture on the front showed a simple lens and a small clip for attaching it to a monitor. Suddenly, I found myself wondering what this little eye could see if it stayed in this room when I was not supposed to be here. I put the webcam back on the shelf for the moment, because I knew if I opened the box right then, I might do something without thinking it through, and one thing my years in business had taught me was that rushed moves often turn into regrets. Still, the idea stayed with me as I went through the rest of the day. Every time I saw someone walk past my office door, every time I noticed Max or Eva glancing in, I caught myself wondering what they would say and do inside these four walls if they knew for sure I was not around to hear them. It was not a comfortable thought, and I did not like that I was having it about my own son. When I finally left the building, the yard was already turning orange in the low light. Drivers were finishing their routes. Forklifts were resting in their corners like tired animals. Boris was sweeping near the back steps, moving slowly, his headphones hanging around his neck instead of over his ears. He looked up when he saw me, gave a small nod, and held my gaze a moment longer than usual. I almost stopped to talk, but my head was too full. I lifted my hand in return and kept walking, promising myself I would clear my thoughts before I reached home. Our apartment smelled like soup when I opened the door. Helga was at the stove, her hair pulled back with the same old clip she had been using for years, stirring a pot with her usual slow rhythm. She turned when she heard me and studied my face before saying anything. She had that way of reading me that no one else did. I tried to smile, but it felt like pushing a heavy box uphill. She asked how the day had gone. I told her in simple terms about the meeting, about Max's new slides, about my name being moved into a smaller box. I left out the jokes about dementia and emotional decisions. I did not want to see those words reflected in her eyes just yet. We sat at our small kitchen table, the one we had bought when Max was still a baby, and I found myself drifting back in time as I ate. I remembered the first version of this life, when the company was only an idea and the yard was a rented patch of cracked concrete. Back then, our kitchen was even smaller. The paint was peeling, and we had a second-hand table with one leg shorter than the others. I worked at a factory during the day, and at night I made calls, visited building sites, and tried to convince contractors to test a new supplier who did not own a single truck yet. Helga sewed clothes for neighbors and brought home coins in a plastic bag. When I finally leased the first van, I could hardly sleep from worry. The payments felt huge. I drove it myself, loading and unloading until my back screamed. There were weeks when we were not sure we would meet the rent. There were nights I came home with dust in my lungs and nothing in my stomach but coffee. But every time I saw Max asleep in his little bed, surrounded by toy cars, I told myself that one day he would not have to work like this. That one day he would walk into offices where people listened to him because of what I had built with these hands. As Max grew, the yard became his playground. He loved the trucks more than any toy. At 5, he followed me around, asking what every lever did, why some pallets were wrapped in plastic and others were not. At 10, he could already read half the labels on the boxes and tell drivers where things went. Customers smiled when they saw him standing next to me. They said he was the future of the company. I believed them. I imagined him one day taking over with respect, not just for the money, but for the effort behind every brick, every crate. When it came time for university, we did not really have the money, but we made it anyway. I took more credit. We refinanced some equipment. Helga cut our budget down to the bone. Max chose business and management, which sounded perfect to me. I told everyone in the yard that my son would come back with the knowledge we never had, that together we would make the company strong and clean for decades. In my mind, the picture was clear. I would teach him the ground, he would teach me the sky, and we would stand in the middle as equals. When he came back with his degree, there really was a golden period, at least at first. He introduced new software that made our paperwork smoother. He redesigned the logo, and I had to admit it looked better. He brought in younger staff who knew how to sell online. We started getting calls from regions we had never reached before. I was proud when I stood with him in meetings and watched him explain our numbers to potential partners with confidence. He sounded like he belonged in those rooms. I thought, this is what all those nights in the van were for. But slowly, without a specific day I can point to, something changed. At first, it was small. In meetings, he would cut me off mid-sentence to correct a detail about a percentage. In front of staff, he would joke that I was the paper era and he was the data era. People laughed, thinking it was cute. I laughed too, because I did not want to be the old man who could not take a joke. But the jokes kept coming, always in one direction. When I suggested cautious moves, he called them fear-based, while his own risky ideas were strategic. He started telling our story differently to outsiders. In his version, the company had been a solid but small family operation until he returned from university and turned it into something serious. My years of scraping by became a warm-up act. His last few years became the main show. At first, I thought it was just youthful pride, that he would soften with time. But with every new client, every small success, his voice grew faster, his patience shorter, and his respect thinner. Helga noticed it, even when I tried to hide it from her. One evening in the living room, she asked why I looked so tired after what she thought had been a good meeting that day. I told her bits and pieces, how Max had contradicted me in front of staff, how Eva had called my caution old man thinking. Helga sat next to me on the old sofa, her hand on my knee, and said that our son sounded more like a stranger lately when he spoke about us. She said she never imagined she would hear him use words like risk and liability in the same sentence as his father. As months went by, the pattern deepened. Max started inviting Helga and me to dinners with his friends, not as equal adults, but more like living proof of his story. He would talk about how he had professionalized the company, how he had rescued it from being stuck in the past. Once, at a small celebration in a restaurant, he joked that if he had not come back from university when he did, we would probably still be writing invoices on napkins. His friends laughed, and one of them asked if I had trouble with computers. I said I managed well enough. Max said that luckily he was there now to keep me from clicking the wrong thing and blowing up our bank account. It was supposed to be funny. Helga did not laugh. The first time I really felt the ground shift under my feet was not in the office, but in our kitchen. Helga told me that Max had visited her for coffee during the day while I was at work. She said he had asked many questions about my health, about whether I was forgetting things, whether I had trouble with stairs, whether I had ever gotten lost while driving. She thought he was worried at first, but the more he asked, the more it sounded like he was filling out a mental form. She asked him directly why he wanted to know all that. He told her he was just planning ahead and wanted to make sure we would be taken care of. When she repeated this to me, I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with age. It was the way she said he had looked at her, polite but distant, like a doctor trying to diagnose a patient from another room. I asked her exactly what he had said, exactly how he had phrased it. She tried to remember every word. He had said that older people sometimes made decisions that could put everything at risk, and that it was better to control those decisions before something happened. He had said he did not want to end up in a situation where he had to clean up after us. A few days later, we went to dinner at Max and Eva's apartment. It was modern, full of glass and chrome, with expensive candles burning on every shelf. Their friends came again, with their smooth clothes and easy laughs. The conversation drifted to parents, inheritance, and responsibility. One man joked that parents were like old buildings. You loved them, but at some point, maintenance became too expensive. People laughed. Eva added that the smart thing was to plan early, to put everything in clear legal form before decline made it messy. She said families fell apart when stubborn older people refused to let go. Max, half laughing, said he was lucky because at least his father had built something solid to pass on. Then he added, more quietly but still loud enough for everyone to hear, that the challenge was making sure that person did not accidentally destroy it with one bad decision before signing everything over. The room went a little quieter at that line. Then someone changed the subject. I sat there feeling like a piece of meat on the table, discussed and measured. Helga squeezed my hand under the cloth, her fingers cold. That night, back home, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Helga moved around the kitchen without turning on the main light, as if she did not want the neighbors to see us through the window. We sat at the table with 2 cups of tea we barely touched. Finally, she looked at me with eyes that were both tired and sharp. She asked me in a low voice if I really believed Max would never put the company and his own future ahead of us. She asked if I was sure he would not sign something, for our protection, that would leave us with nothing but kind words and maybe a spare room somewhere. I opened my mouth to reassure her like I always did, to say that our son might be arrogant, but he was not cruel. The words did not come easily this time. I felt the image of the small webcam in my office flash through my mind, the way my name had looked in that smaller box on Max's slide, the way he had spoken about unclear authority and older founders. I forced a smile I did not feel and told her that Max would never push us out like that he loved us too much. She nodded, but she did not look convinced. As we sat there in silence, her question stayed hanging in the air, heavier than the steam from our forgotten tea. The next morning I woke up feeling older than my years, like someone had quietly added weight to my bones during the night. Helga moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast, but the usual small talk was missing. We both knew that if we started really talking, the words might not stop. So instead, we asked about simple things, like whether it would rain, whether the bus would be crowded, whether I had enough pills in the box. When I left, she followed me to the door and held onto my sleeve a little longer than usual, then let go as if she was afraid of breaking something if she pulled harder. On the bus, I watched buildings slide past and tried to put my thoughts in order. I kept hearing Helga's question in my head, like a slow drum. Was I sure Max would not sign something for our protection that would leave us empty? For the first time, I did not have a clean answer for myself. I also kept seeing that small webcam on my office shelf, the one we had never used. The idea of spying on my own son made my stomach twist, but the idea of walking blind into whatever he was planning felt worse. Somewhere between two stops, I realized that my trust and his behavior no longer matched, and that something would have to change, whether I liked it or not. At the yard, things looked normal at first glance. The same trucks lined up, the same men shouted instructions, the same forklifts beeped. I walked my usual route, greeted the drivers, listened to their complaints about fuel prices and bad roads. On the surface, my world still existed, but under that surface, I could almost feel the shift, like when you stand on ice and hear it cracking far below. Inside the main building, the screens glowed as always, but I noticed that fewer messages had my name on them. New project channels popped up without my involvement. I was no longer the center of the web, just a small knot on the side. Around mid-morning, Max asked me to join a smaller meeting in one of the glass rooms off the main office. Inside were Max, Eva, and our senior accountant, Lena. They had papers spread out on the table, some printed slides, some handwritten notes. Max said they wanted to talk about risk management and succession planning in more detail. He spoke in his usual smooth tone, but there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth that I had learned to read. Eva sat slightly turned toward him, as if they were one unit, and I was something else entirely. Max began by saying that regulators and potential partners like to see clear plans for what would happen if something happened to a key person. He looked at me when he said key person, but not with respect, more like someone talking about fragile equipment. He then said that, given my age and what he called recent signs of strain, it might be responsible to consider official evaluations, just to reassure everyone that the company would not be exposed if my health suddenly worsened. I asked quietly what he meant by evaluations. He answered that there were standard tests for cognitive function and mental fitness, that some boards asked older members to undergo them. He said this as if he was talking about a routine vehicle inspection. Eva added that families sometimes refused these steps out of pride, and that this caused problems later when someone actually declined. She said she cared about protecting me from stress and preventing rumors. She suggested that if we did everything transparently, nobody could accuse us of hiding anything. The words sounded like concern, but the structure underneath them was clear. They wanted a formal written path to label me unfit if it suited their plans. Lena stayed mostly quiet, her eyes on the table, but she shifted uncomfortably when Eva said they might have to involve doctors and legal advisors to make sure my decisions were safe. I did not shout. I did not pound the table. I asked Max if he truly believed I was unable to read and sign documents, or if he simply wanted to prevent me from using that ability without his permission. He avoided my eyes for a second before saying that this was about the company, not about personal feelings, and that he needed to think long-term. That was the moment when something inside me finally stopped bending. It did not explode. It simply became still, like water, that suddenly freezes mid-wave. I understood then that waiting for him to remember who I was would not work. He had already chosen the story he wanted to live in. And I was not the hero in it. After the meeting, I went back to my office and closed the door. I sat behind my desk and looked at the familiar objects around me. The photo of Max as a child suddenly felt like a picture of a stranger. The award on the wall for lifetime contribution felt like a joke. On the shelf, the small cardboard box with the webcam almost seemed to lean toward me. I stood, took it down, and this time I did not put it back. I opened the plastic with careful fingers as if I were unwrapping a dangerous tool. The device was simple, just a small dark eye and a cable. Nothing special, and yet, at that moment, it felt like a key. Before installing it, I knew I had to understand how it would work in this building. I could not go to Max or his people and ask openly, so I chose another route. I left my office, walked through the open space, and said casually to one of the IT guys that I wanted to understand our security better, especially how cameras and recordings were handled. I told him a story about a friend whose office had been robbed and how that friend only found out later that the cameras had not been working. I said I did not want to be in the same situation. He took me to the small server room, that cold space with humming machines and cables running like vines. He showed me the screens with feeds from the yard cameras, explained where the recordings were stored, how long they were kept, and how additional internal cameras could be connected if needed. He talked about storage limits, about simple software that could send a live feed to a specific device. I listened carefully, nodded, pretended to be slightly confused by the technical terms so he would explain them in simpler language. When he mentioned that a small camera could be plugged into a computer and used as an internal meeting camera, I asked if it could also record the room quietly when the software was open. He said yes, if configured that way, it was possible. When I returned to my office, the plan was already forming in my head, not as something grand, but as a set of small, careful steps. I would not break any laws. I would not hack anything. I would simply use a device connected to my own office computer in a room that belonged to me as much as to anyone, and observe what happened when people thought I was not there. It felt strange to think of my own office as a place where I needed to spy, but after that meeting about evaluations and mental fitness, I no longer felt safe trusting my son's version of reality. That evening, after most staff had left, I stayed behind under the polite excuse of catching up on old paperwork. The office grew quieter with each closing door. The open plan area went dark, except for a few blinking lights. My room remained lit, a small island at the end of the corridor. I closed the blinds halfway and placed the small camera on a shelf across from my desk, hidden between two large binders that almost completely blocked it from casual view. I adjusted the angle on my screen, watching the live image of my own empty chair. The camera saw the desk, the guest chairs, and enough of the door to capture anyone sitting or standing in front of me. I set the software to record when the computer was awake and to send a copy to a folder I knew how to find. I tested it by leaving the room, closing the door, then walking back in and sitting down. When I replayed the short clip, I saw myself move slowly into the frame, rubbing my temples. The quality was not perfect, but clear enough to recognize faces and hear words. It was enough. I named the folder something boring, a word that would not catch anyone's eye, and minimize the window. As I was finishing, there was a soft knock on the open door. Boris stood there, holding his mop bucket in one hand, his headphones in the other. His eyes went to my face, then did a quick sweep of the room, as if checking for other people. I asked if he needed something. He shook his head and said he was just doing his rounds. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the quiet building. He hesitated, then stepped inside and said he had seen some strange things lately. People in my office when I was gone, people talking like the room belonged to them. He said he was not sure if he should say anything because he did not want problems, but he had known me a long time. I told him he could speak freely with me. He said that he had heard talk about me in the corridors late at night, about how it would be better when I was off the stage, about how some things would be signed in my name even if I was not there. He did not give many details, but he said enough for me to understand that my fear was not just in my head. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. He said that if I really wanted to know who walked into this office and what they said when they thought I was gone, I should make sure any camera I used was watching next Tuesday at 7 in the evening. The way he said it, with that exact time, made the hairs on my arms stand up. I asked why that time. He said he had heard them planning a small internal talk here then, after official hours, something about documents and signatures. He said he did not want to be involved beyond this, and that if anyone asked, he had said nothing. Then he left, pushing his bucket down the corridor, the wheels making a soft rattling sound that faded into the distance. I sat back at my desk and stared at the screen, where the small live image of my own office waited patiently. The building was almost completely silent now, just the distant hum of machines and the occasional creak of old pipes. I moved the mouse, opened my calendar, and scrolled to next Tuesday. Slowly, I clicked on the square for that day and created a reminder for 7 in the evening, just one short line of text that only I would see, and when I pressed save, the little red mark on that date began to glow at the edge of my vision like a warning light on the dashboard of a truck. The days between that quiet conversation with Boris and the following Tuesday stretched out like thin rubber, slow and tense. I went through my routine as if nothing had changed, but every small sound in the office felt louder. When someone laughed in the corridor, I wondered if they were laughing about me. When Max stepped into my office to ask some simple question about an old client, I watched his face carefully, trying to see if any guilt lived there. I saw nothing but the familiar, controlled confidence he wore like a suit. Helga noticed I was distracted at home. I told her I was just tired, that the meeting about evaluations had taken more out of me than I expected. She said she understood, but the way she watched me when she thought I was not looking told me she understood more than I wanted her to. 2 days before Tuesday, I brought up the idea of taking a short break. At breakfast, I told Helga that my head felt crowded, that I might go away for a few days alone to breathe and think. She frowned because we had never done that before. We always took trips together, or not at all. I said that this time I wanted to walk near the sea, or at least pretend to, without thinking about routes and schedules for anyone else. She asked if this had to do with Max and the company. I said it was connected to everything and nothing. I promised to call her every day and to tell her if I needed her. She looked at me for a long moment and then nodded slowly, as if she was placing her trust on the table and hoping nobody would knock it off. At the office, I mentioned my plan to Max in a casual way. I told him I was thinking of going on a short vacation next week, somewhere away from the city, maybe the coast. I said I wanted to rest and stay offline as much as possible. His face lit up immediately, almost too quickly. He said it was a great idea, that I deserved a break. He said he would hold everything together while I was gone and that I should not worry if I did not see his messages for a few days. He added that it might even help with perception, since people would see that I was stepping back and trusting the new leadership. I pretended to agree. Inside, a part of me felt sick. His quick approval told me more than any careful explanation could. That evening, instead of researching beach hotels, I sat at the kitchen table with my old laptop and looked up a cheap business hotel on the edge of our own city. It was near an industrial area, with a view of a parking lot and a fast food place, not the sea, the price was low, the rooms were simple, that was exactly what I needed. I booked 3 nights starting Tuesday morning. Helga thought I was choosing a place near the coastline. I did not correct her. It hurt to lie to her, but if I told her everything before I had proof, I knew she would not sleep at all. On Monday after work, I stayed a little later than usual again. The office slowly emptied, lights clicking off one by one. I closed my door, opened the software linked to the hidden camera, and checked that everything worked. The camera showed my desk, my chair, and the space in front of it clearly enough. I changed a small setting so that the recording would save not only to the office computer but also stream to my laptop when connected. I tested it by leaving the building, sitting in my car in the dark yard, and pulling out my laptop. After a moment, the screen showed my empty office, exactly as I had left it. I watched myself walk back in a few minutes later. The system worked. I turned everything off and went home with the feeling that I was carrying an invisible device even when my hands were empty. On Tuesday morning, I packed a small bag at home. Helga folded shirts for me, added my shaving kit, and tucked in a book she thought I might want to read by the water. She kissed my cheek and told me to really rest. I hugged her tighter than usual. She smelled like soap and onions from the kitchen. I wanted to tell her everything, but I held back. If what I feared turned out to be wrong, I did not want to poison her heart against our son for no reason. If it was right, there would be enough pain later without adding extra now. I left the apartment, took the bus as usual, but instead of getting off at the company, I stayed seated and rode 2 more stops to the hotel district. I checked into the business hotel under my own name. The receptionist gave me a key card and a practiced smile, then turned back to her screen. The room was small and plain. The window looked out over a row of parked trucks and a billboard for a discount supermarket. The bedspread was a dull color. There was a small desk, a chair, and a television I had no intention of turning on. It was not beautiful, but it was quiet, and the distance between me and the office was just enough that nobody would expect me to walk back in on a whim. From the hotel, I sent Helga a message saying I had arrived safely and that the journey had been less tiring than I expected. I sent Max a short note as well, saying I was checked in and would be offline for most of the day except for emergencies. He replied almost immediately, telling me to relax and leave the company to him. I put the phone face down on the desk. Then I opened my laptop, connected it to the hotel Wi-Fi, and tested the connection to my office camera. The screen flickered once and then showed my empty office again, lit by the same pale light from the windows. I watched for a while as people passed by the door in the corridor, just shadows crossing the frame. The hours until evening crawled. I tried to read the book Helga had packed, but the words would not stick. I walked up and down the small room. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I kept looking at the digital clock on the bedside table. Every few minutes, I checked the camera feed, even though I knew the important moment would not come until 7. At one point, I turned everything off and sat in the armchair with my eyes closed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of trucks reversing outside. I felt like a man waiting in a hospital corridor for news he could not influence. As the afternoon thinned into evening, my body grew more restless. At 6:30, I made myself a cup of instant coffee from the sachets next to the kettle. It tasted like warm dust, but it gave my hands something to do. At 6:50, I opened the laptop again and logged into the feed. My office appeared on the screen, empty and still, the clock on the wall showing the same time as the clock on the bedside table. I adjusted the angle a bit so that the door frame was fully visible in the corner of the image. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, laptop balanced on my knees, and waited. At exactly 7, the office door opened. Max walked in first. He wore one of his dark suits, but his tie was loosened. He sat in my chair as if it had always belonged to him. Eva came in behind him, balancing a tablet and a stack of papers. She hopped up to sit on the front edge of my desk, crossing her legs casually where I had signed so many deals. A moment later, Lena entered with a folder, looking nervous. She closed the door behind her and checked the corridor through the glass once before turning back to them. I could not hear every word clearly at first, but as they settled, the microphone picked up more. Max began talking about how this was the perfect time to formalize everything, since I was conveniently away. He said people would believe that any documents dated this week had been discussed before I decided to take my little vacation. He laughed when he used that phrase. Ava agreed and said that the board would be easier to convince if they saw a clean package, a medical note, a temporary delegation of authority, and a few signed forms that looked like they had my blessing. She waved some pages in front of her, and the camera caught just enough for me to see my name printed at the bottom of one of them. Lena spoke less, but when she did, her words made my stomach twist. She reminded them that my signature would be needed for some of those changes. Max said that was not a real problem. He said they already had enough samples of my signature on file, that I always signed the same way, slowly and carefully. He said he knew how to get my agreement in spirit, if not in person, and that at our age, people often did not remember exactly which papers they had signed on which days. Eva added that if I later questioned anything, they could always point to my age and suggest I was confused, that maybe I had forgotten. They discussed a doctor's name, someone Eva knew through a friend, who would be willing to write a cautious report about stress-related cognitive concerns, if asked the right questions. They planned how to frame it as concern for my health, not an attack, so that outsiders would see them as caring children rather than predators. They spoke about presenting the board with an emergency plan in which my rights would be temporarily transferred to Max to protect me and the company. The word temporarily came up many times, but the way Max leaned back in my chair when he said it told me he had no intention of giving anything back once it was in his hands. As I listened, my chest tightened, my breath grew shallow. There was a moment when the screen blurred, and I thought I might faint right there in the hotel room. My own son was sitting in my seat, planning to use my trust, my age, and even the softness of my memory as tools to pry my hands off the company. He was not only thinking about the business, he was building a story where I would be the confused old man who needed protection from himself, and he was doing it while assuming I was somewhere by the sea, walking alone, unaware. I forced myself to keep watching, gripping the edge of the mattress until my knuckles hurt. I paid attention to details that might later matter more than my feelings. The date they wanted to present to the board, the name of the doctor, the phrase they wanted to use in the resolution, the way they spoke about my supposed decline as if it were a marketing problem. I saw Lena hesitate when Max asked her to prepare drafts that looked like I had approved them before leaving. She said she was not comfortable backdating signatures. Eva told her that sometimes you had to be practical and that nobody would scrutinize paperwork involving a tired old man and his caring children. Eventually, the meeting ended. Max stood up from my chair as if he owned the air in the room. He told the others that once this was done, the company would finally be clean in the eyes of investors, with one clear leader and no emotional risks. Lena gathered her folder with stiff fingers. Eva straightened her blouse and checked her reflection in the dark computer screen. Then they left, turning off the light. The office went dark on my laptop, and for a second the screen showed my own strained face reflected faintly back at me. My hands were shaking when I moved the mouse. I saved the recording to the folder and then copied it to a small USB drive I had brought with me. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, each percent feeling like a nail being driven into wood. When it finished, I checked the file twice to make sure it played. I then saved another copy to a separate location, just in case. Only when I had at least 2 versions did I let myself lean back and close my eyes. I felt heavy and hollow at the same time. The betrayal hurt in a way I had no words for. It was not just about money or titles. It was about the way they had spoken of me, as if I were already half gone, as if my confusion was an asset they could use. But under that pain, another feeling slowly formed, quieter and harder. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not guessing anymore. I did not have to wonder whether my fears were just old man paranoia. I had seen and heard exactly what they planned to do. And that same recording that almost broke me also showed me where every crack in their plan was. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, the laptop suddenly made a sharp little sound. A new notification popped up in the corner of the screen. It was an email from Max sent at 7:03 in the evening with a subject line that read, in calm, clean letters, "Formalizing transition documents." When I saw that subject line on the screen, my first instinct was to delete the email without opening it, as if that would somehow erase what I had just watched on the recording. Then I reminded myself that pretending not to see things was exactly how I had ended up in this position. I clicked it open. Max wrote that while I was on my well-deserved break, he wanted to move ahead with formal transition documents so that partners and banks would feel secure. He suggested that when I came back, we could quickly sign a few prepared forms, nothing heavy, just clarifying roles. He wrote that this would protect me from stress and lock in his authority in a way everyone would find comfortable. Reading those lines while his voice from 20 minutes earlier still echoed in my head made something inside me go very still. I did not reply to him that night. I closed the laptop, sat on the edge of the hotel bed, and stared at the wall. The room felt smaller than it had in the morning. Trucks moved in the parking lot outside, their reversing beeps faint through the window. I held the USB drive in my hand and turned it between my fingers, feeling its tiny weight. Inside that little piece of plastic and metal were my son's plans to erase me, and also the map of how to stop him. It was a strange kind of power to hold. I slept badly, in short pieces, waking up to the same thought again and again. This cannot continue as it is, and I am the only one who can change it. In the morning, I called Helga from the hotel room. I told her the weather was gray, but the air felt different, that I had walked a little, and that it had helped my head. I did not mention the camera or the video. She asked if I was eating. I said I was. She asked if I was resting. I lied and said I was. Then I told her I might not stay the full time, that I had realized there were some matters at home I needed to handle sooner rather than later. She sounded worried, but said she trusted me. I promised that whatever I decided, it would be for our safety, not for my pride. After the call, I dialed another number, one I had not used in some time, Mr. Adler's office. His assistant answered and asked if it was urgent. I told her that it was important and that I would prefer to speak with him today, not next week. She said he had a gap around noon if I could come. I said I would be there. I packed the USB inside a small inner pocket of my jacket, checked twice that it was really there, and left the hotel. The ride to his office felt longer than it truly was. Every traffic light felt like a test of patience. Adler's building was the same as always, an old structure with a restored front and a worn staircase. His waiting room still had the same brown chairs and the same quiet air. When he called me in, he greeted me with the calm politeness I remembered, asked after Helga, asked if I was keeping up with my pills. Only then did he ask what brought me in. I sat down, took a breath, and told him that I needed to show him something that hurt me to even think about, but that I needed his eyes on it. I opened the laptop on his desk, plugged in the USB, and played the recording. He watched without interrupting. His face did not move much, but I could tell when certain lines landed, because his eyes narrowed slightly or his jaw tightened. He listened to Max speak about forging consent in spirit, about using my age as a shield for their actions. He heard Eva talk about doctors and mental fitness, about framing me as a confused father who needed protection from his own decisions. He heard Lena being pushed to backdate things. When the screen finally went dark, the room was completely quiet except for the faint hum of his computer. Adler folded his hands and sat back in his chair. He did not use big words. He said that what I had just shown him was not only betrayal, but also clear evidence of an attempt to misuse my name and health for control. He said this could be important if things ever reached court, but that we might not need to go that far. He reminded me that I still held certain rights, still occupied certain positions, and still had choices. Then he asked me what I wanted. He did not ask what I felt. He asked what outcome I could live with. I told him I did not want to send my son to prison, did not want a scandal that would split the family in front of strangers. I said I did not care about punishing Max in the way angry people imagine when they talk about revenge. I cared about not being used, about protecting Helga, about not waking up one day to find my own name used to push me out into the street. I said I wanted distance and dignity, not drama. I wanted to make sure that if Max wanted to be the king, he would stand on his own ground, not on a foundation with my face painted on it. Adler nodded slowly and said that gave him enough to work with. He began to outline options in simple language. He said we could block any attempt to use supposed mental decline as a reason to strip my rights by putting my clear will on record now, while nobody could claim confusion. He said we could notify certain people quietly. The bank that held our company lines, the board members who still respected me, a few key partners. He said we could make it clear, through the proper channels, that any document presented later as signed by me without witnesses or proper procedure would be questioned. He did not list every legal clause. He just promised that he could help me close the doors my son thought were open. I signed some instructions that allowed him to represent my interests in upcoming discussions. I did not read every line, because I knew he would explain them if I asked, and because I understood the overall direction. We were not attacking, we were defending, and we were doing it in advance. When I finished, I asked him if he thought Max and Eva would stop if confronted quietly. Adler said in his experience, people who talk like they did on that recording rarely stop unless something bigger than them forces them to. He suggested we let structures, not emotions, do the work. From Adler's office, I went to the bank. Miss Roth met me in a small meeting room with glass walls and a simple table. She asked how business was going and how I was feeling. I told her business was changing fast and that I needed clarity about my personal position. I did not show her the recording. I told her that I was considering stepping back from some guarantees and wanted to know how that would affect the company. She explained calmly that the bank had extended credit based in part on my history and commitments. If I reduced or withdrew those, the bank would have to review terms, maybe tighten limits, maybe ask for new security. I asked her, in plain words, if the bank would automatically honor any document that claimed I had agreed to something on a date when I might have been away or unwell. She said the bank relied on signatures, but also on context. If there was evidence of any pressure or altered capacity, they had a duty to look deeper. She told me that the bank's first interest was stability and legality, not helping one side of a family outmaneuver another. Hearing that did not solve everything, but it made one thing clear. Max did not control the whole field. Other players had rules too. Later in the afternoon, I went to see one more person, Mr. Kroll from Nordline Group. I did not tell him every detail. I asked him, as if hypothetically, what he would do if he learned that a company's current leadership had plotted to frame its founder as mentally unfit just to gain faster control. He looked at me with a long, steady gaze and said he had done business with many companies and had seen many power games, but that he trusted people, not logos. He reminded me of nights when I had personally delivered goods to his father's sites, when our drivers had worked extra hours to help them meet a deadline. He said if he ever had to choose between staying with a structure built on that kind of betrayal or following the person who had always dealt straight with him, he knew where his conscience would go. He did not promise anything loudly. He did not need to. By the time I returned to the hotel that evening, my legs were heavy, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I called Helga again and told her I would be coming home the next day instead of staying longer. I said I had realized there were things we had to discuss face to face. She asked if Max knew about my change of plan. I said I would tell him soon. She did not press for details, only said she would cook something warm for when I arrived. Her voice was tired but steady. When I finally turned on my main phone again, after 2 days of keeping it off, messages poured in. Max had written twice more, asking if I was resting, saying he was preparing a small, strategic vision event at a hotel next week, and that it would be a perfect moment to honor my legacy while presenting the new governance structure. He wanted me on stage briefly, to smile and nod while he laid out his plan. Staff emails mentioned the event too, full of excited talk about banners and presentations and important guests. There were messages from the bank, and one from Adler, confirming certain appointments. I read Max's invitation carefully. He described the event as a celebration of the company's future, with key clients, board members, and partners present. He said he wanted to show the world a strong, unified front. He did not realize he had just handed me the perfect stage. I forwarded the email to Adler with a short note saying that this was where everything would become clear. His reply came back quickly. He agreed that such a public setting, with the right people in the room, would be the safest place to let the truth show its face. The next days passed in a kind of quiet preparation. I went home to Helga, sat at our kitchen table, and told her more than before, though not every legal detail. I explained that Max and Eva had been planning to push me out and that I had proof. I told her I was working with Adler and that we would handle it through official channels, not shouting matches. She cried a little when I said those words, more from relief than shock, because somewhere in her heart she had already known. She said she would rather live in a smaller apartment with our heads held high than stay in a big one built on our son's lies. On the morning of the event, I woke up early. I chose my clothes carefully, not trying to look younger, just clean and solid. I shaved slowly, combed my thinning hair, and put on the same dark jacket I had worn to sign the company's first major contract years ago. In the inner pocket, I placed the USB drive with the recording. I checked that it was really there by touching it through the fabric, feeling its small outline. Helga handed me my old thermos out of habit. I smiled and left it on the kitchen counter. This time, I wanted both hands free. Outside the hotel where the event was held, banners with our company logo hung over the entrance, shining in the weak sun. Staff stood around in their best clothes, greeting guests, pinning name tags to jackets. I saw a few familiar faces, drivers who had put on ties, office workers standing stiffly in new shoes, board members chatting near the doors. Max moved among them like a host at a wedding, shaking hands, laughing, guiding people toward the conference hall. Eva stood near the registration table, checking the list, smiling just enough. I spotted Boris against one wall, holding a tray of glasses for some catering company. His uniform different, but his eyes the same. When he saw me, he gave the smallest nod, almost nothing, but enough. Lena stood near the back, her hands clenched around a folder, her face pale. She looked away quickly when Max called her over. Near the side entrance, I saw Adler speaking quietly with 2 board members, and, a little further away, Ms. Roth from the bank, adjusting the strap of her handbag. I took a breath and stepped inside. The corridor leading to the main hall smelled of coffee and new carpet. From behind the closed double doors, I heard the faint crackle of a microphone being tested, a low voice saying a few words to check the sound. In my pocket, the USB pressed lightly against my palm as I slid my hand inside my jacket. As one of the staff members pulled the conference doors open for the guests to enter, I walked forward with everyone else, feeling the room's attention begin to turn toward the stage where my son was about to present his clean new future, unaware that I was carrying the one small piece of plastic that could change the whole script in front of all of them. We gathered in the conference hall under bright lights, our logo above the words Strategic Vision. I sat in the middle rows, not in the front seat with my name on it. I saw Adler and the bank's representative in the crowd and Mr. Kroll near the back. We nodded once and waited. Max walked onto the stage to polite applause. He thanked everyone, talked about growth and the future, then called me the man who started it all and asked me to stand. I rose, nodded, sat again. The room looked at me, then turned back to him. He began explaining new governance, one clear leader, streamlined authority. His hand moved toward the remote. Before he could press it, Adler stood and asked the technician to play a short internal security clip at the founder's request. The technician hesitated, then switched inputs. The lights dimmed. My office filled the screen. People shifted. Then they saw Max in my chair, Eva on my desk, Lena near the door. They heard my son talk about my age and my vacation, about backdating papers, about how easy it would be to say I had forgotten what I signed. They heard him describe me as confused and useful. They heard Eva plan a doctor's note and a story about protecting me from myself. Their recorded laughter sounded sharp in the silent hall. When the video ended, nobody spoke. Adler said this was why any new document with my name should be treated with care. The bank's representative added that structural changes would be frozen until a review. I stood and said that if my son wanted to lead, he would do so without my guarantees, without my signature, and without my weakness as his shield. Then I walked out. The last thing I heard before the doors closed was Max calling my name into a room that was finally seeing him clearly.